One of the president's signature policies hitting a major setback from the high court yesterday, but he's vowing not to let the ruling stop his tariff plan.
That's right. President Trump announcing a new global tariff immediately after the Supreme Court struck down his Liberation Day tariffs in a ruling that came down yesterday. The president posting on Truth Social, quote, "It is my great honor to have just signed from the Oval Office a global 10% tariff on all countries, which will be effective almost immediately."
The new global levies will be implemented using the Trade Act of 1974, which allows the president to impose tariffs up to 15% to address a large and serious balance of payment deficit.
In the decision to block the tariffs, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote, quote, go ahead.
The president enjoys no inherent authority to impose tariffs during peacetime, and it does not defend the challenged tariffs as an exercise of the president's war-making powers. The United States, after all, is not at war with every nation in the world.
But Justice Kavanaugh is slamming the ruling as illogical. Quote, "If quotas and embargoes are a means to regulate importation, how are tariffs not a means to regulate importation? Nothing in the text suggests an illogical distinction."
Meanwhile, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says the ruling is a major blow to U.S. citizens. Watch.
Today was a loss for the American people because by taking away President Trump's instantaneous leverage using the IEEPA authority, the American people have suffered a significant setback. Think to this time last year when President Trump put on the fentanyl tariffs, and then we saw a rapid decline in fentanyl deaths. If that's not an emergency authority, what was?
As expected, Democrats celebrating the decision and some even trying to cash in. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker sending an invoice to the White House demanding $8 billion be refunded to his state.
Trump's tariff fight has been a legal and political battle for more than a year. So let's walk through that timeline here on the wall. So it was back in February 1st, 2025, just weeks after President Trump reassumed office, that he issues the executive orders announcing 25% tariff on Canada, Mexico, and China to stop the illegal drug flow, declaring that an emergency that gave him that powers. Later in April, President Trump announces Liberation Day tariffs, invoking the IEEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, to implement a global 10% tariff and reciprocal tariffs. If you remember at that time, all of the experts announced that it was going to destroy the economy. It was going to, inflation was going to skyrocket, unemployment was going to skyrocket, and the stock market was going to crash. It's been kind of interesting to see what has happened since then. Then in November, President Trump, using these powers and negotiating with China, announces a deal with China, lowering those tariffs in exchange for soybean purchases and withdrawing certain controls on rare earth minerals. And then, of course, in January of this year, the White House extends the national emergencies to justify tariffs on another year in Canada, Mexico, and China. What's interesting is, of course, every single one of the predictions that politicians made and all of the economic experts made have completely fallen flat. Inflation is down, employment is up, the stock market is roaring, and just last week we learned that imports last year into the United States were at the highest level in history.
You talk about roaring, by the way. What wasn't in that Supreme Court decision was anything about whether or not this $175 billion in tariffs would go back to America, be refunded to American companies. That's a big question this morning. And you had people like Senator Kennedy saying, you know, Democrats better beware about celebrating, because if you give $175 billion back to American countries, the economy is going to roar like it's never roared, which by the midterms could be really devastating for Democrats.
This is what the New York Post says. It says, this means more, showing that the president has no intention of backing down despite the rulings. Here's Peter Doocy asking President Trump about those $175 billion in refunds. Watch.
So since Liberation Day, there's about $175 billion in tariff revenue that is now in limbo. Do you have to refund $175 billion?
Think of it, Peter. Very fair question. They take months and months to write an opinion, and they don't even discuss that point. We've taken in hundreds of billions of dollars, not millions, hundreds of billions of dollars, And so I said, well, what happens to all the money that we took in? It wasn't discussed. Wouldn't you think they would have put one sentence in there saying that keep the money or don't keep the money, right? I guess it has to get litigated for the next 2 years. So they write this terrible, defective decision, totally defective. It's almost like not written by smart people. And what they do, they don't even talk about that. Your question is very basic. That was the first question I asked also to make you feel good. I said, what about all the money that we've taken in? Sir, they don't discuss that. How crazy is that?
So let's bring in attorney and Fox Business correspondent Lydia, who is so glad to have you here on the couch. You're the perfect person to have on to talk about. So let's talk about that. Does that money have to sit in a pot and we can't touch it until it's litigated on? What's going to happen?
Boy, this decision in some ways answered some questions, but also gave us a lot more questions, many more questions that have to be answered. And yeah, President Trump is right. Chief among them is what happens to all the monies that have been collected through the IEPA from these tariffs. It's upwards of roughly $175 billion by some estimates. We know that more than 1,000 companies have already lined up filing proactively lawsuits against the Trump administration in anticipation of this decision from the Supreme Court, because they're prepared to litigate this. They want their money back.
They want their money back.
Yeah.
Where is the money? Just out of curiosity, where does it go?
With the federal government, I mean, this is going to be a coordination between CBP and the Department of Treasury to set up some type of process to return the money. But it's kind of a two-step problem. First, there has to be determination that the money actually has to be returned. And even just answering that basic question is now going to be something for the lower courts that they're going to have to wade through, specifically the Court of International Trade, which is based here in Manhattan. They're going to have to decide who gets money back, and then a process will have to be set up.
We should have had checks going out to Americans, and then they wouldn't have been able to get it back.
Maybe so.
So it is, and of course he's right. It will take years of litigation,
Yeah.
and of course all of these countries have reached deals with the United States because of President Trump. So it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. But one of the things that just sort of astounds me is how wrong the experts, obviously the political foes have been wrong at every turn, Democrats and Republicans, but the political experts have been so wrong at every step about these tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, remember back last year, early when he started rolling out these tariffs, we were told, expect a recession, the stock market's going to crash. And it was like the exact opposite. You know, more recently, we're seeing inflation is moderating. We're seeing projections for growth in the economy. We did see some questions coming out of the most recent GDP read, but largely taking a step back and looking at the big picture, we are on an upswing. We see a lot of reasons to be very optimistic. None of those projections actually came true. And in large part, President Trump says tariffs are to credit for that. It has changed kind of the United States on the world standing and encouraging foreign nations and companies to reinvest in America and long term really change the picture when it comes to manufacturing and providing jobs back here at home.
It's really interesting as we unpack all this. Obviously, the president moving forward with this 1974 Section 122 of the Trade Act to impose the 150-day 10% tariffs, and then that will sunset because Congress has to approve an extenuation. But what would stop him from just issuing a new one?
Right. That's a great question, Griff. You know, I fully anticipate, like the Trump administration has said, they are prepared with a plan B. They're going to roll out additional tariffs using other provisions, 122, 201, 301. They have a whole litany of other options that are available to them. And I think we can fully expect them to use these types of tariff regimes in new and creative ways, just like they attempted with IEPA. They might try to stretch these other tariff statutes to the limit, but in no way do I expect tariffs to go away.
Lydia, Secretary of Treasury Bessent was on Will Kane's show, and here's what he had to say.
President Trump will always put our national security and Americans first. And as I have said before, the president has multiple tools in his toolbox. Let's be clear about what today's ruling was and what it wasn't. The court did not rule against President Trump's tariffs. 6 justices simply ruled that IEPA authorities cannot be used to raise even $1 of revenue.
So that aired during the Will Kane hour, but apparently...
But he did have an interview with Scott Bessent.
I guess, as Charlie said, Will force the secretary to stand up behind a podium during the interview. Boy, I mean, this is obviously President Trump and the Secretary of Treasury saying we have other tools at our disposal. Can you just talk to me politically? You just laid out the case for why these tariffs have brought jobs back, have forced companies to, set up plants here instead of offshoring them in other countries, and now they're employing more Americans. I mean, yeah, they get the "we got you, Donald Trump," but how does this politically play out when your policy or what you're cheering for actually hurts American workers?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a lot of layers to that. One thing that I think is really interesting is that when we heard a lot of the complaints about the tariff regime, take a look at who challenged these tariffs. They weren't the big companies. You didn't have the Walmarts and the Costcos of the world coming forward with the challenges to the tariffs. It was small businesses. It was folks on Main Street that were saying, hey, you know what? These tariffs, we understand where you're coming from. A lot of these folks actually voted for President Trump, and they believed in him. But they said, at the end of the day, they are hurting some small businesses, and they're going to make it hard for us to survive and even keep our doors open. So for them, they're hoping to see some relief. And through all of this, I wonder if there's a political moment for President Trump to say, you know what, Main Street, I see you. And if we do have refunds here, I want to make sure that you get them first. Yeah. Because now who's filing these lawsuits? It's Costco, it's Bumblebee Tuna, it's the big companies that are now taking advantage of what the Supreme Court just delivered to them, when really it was the small businesses that stuck their neck out to stick up for themselves. And that's why I say that. I think President Trump should notice that.
And that's why you can see the economy roaring. Just in the last few seconds I've got left, I have to ask this. All of these trade deals that the president reached by bringing him to the negotiating table because of the tariffs, even if tariffs go away, just hypothetically, they totally go away. Do those trade deals with those countries, are they binding? Can they back out of that?
That's a huge question. And Jameson Greer spoke about that particular point yesterday. At this point, it sounds like the administration and Mr. Greer, Trade Representative Greer, are confident that these trade agreements are going to stick. But you know what? President Trump is going to be visiting China, end of March, and it'll be very interesting to see how that conversation unfolds. Using tariffs, the president was able to get China to agree to buy more agricultural products, buy soybeans from our farmers. Are they going to stick to that? They've not been known to really stick into their deals, like in the big picture. So we'll have to see.
Yeah, but however much China does stick to deals, they're going to, at the very least, it's going to be wound up.
There's a significant legal and economic development unfolding right now that's going to affect a lot of people. The Supreme Court has struck down President Trump's so-called Liberation Day tariffs, ruling that the emergency powers he used weren't applicable in this situation. But here's where it gets interesting. Immediately after that ruling, the president announced a new 10% global tariff using different legal authority. So what does all this actually mean? Let's break it down calmly and look at what's happening from a few different angles. According to reports, the Supreme Court ruled that the president couldn't use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, to impose these widespread tariffs. Chief Justice John Roberts reportedly wrote that while the president has inherent authority over tariffs in certain contexts, the United States isn't at war with every nation in the world, which was part of the legal reasoning. In response, President Trump immediately signed a new 10% global tariff using the Trade Act of 1974, which apparently allows presidents to impose tariffs up to 15% to address serious balance of payment deficits. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent described the court's decision as a loss for the American people, pointing to examples like fentanyl tariffs that he says led to declining overdose deaths. Now here's a complication. There's reportedly about $175 billion in tariff revenue that's been collected, but is now in legal limbo. The president himself asked what happens to all that money, and apparently the court's decision didn't address that question, meaning more litigation ahead. From an everyday person's perspective, this is pretty confusing. On one hand, you have Democrats and some small businesses celebrating the ruling, saying these tariffs were hurting American consumers and small operations trying to keep their doors open. Illinois Governor Pritzker is even sending an invoice demanding $8 billion back for his state. On the other hand, you have the administration and supporters pointing to economic data. They note that despite expert predictions of recession, stock market crashes, and skyrocketing inflation, none of that happened. In fact, according to the reports, inflation has moderated, employment is up, the stock market has been strong, and imports hit historic levels last year. So which is it? Are tariffs helping or hurting? That's where reasonable people can look at the same information and come to different conclusions. Let's consider a few perspectives here. Small businesses, not the giant corporations like Walmart or Costco, were apparently the ones who challenged these tariffs in court. They were saying, look, we voted for this president, we understand the goal, but these tariffs are making it really hard to operate. That's a legitimate concern from people trying to make a living. At the same time, the administration argues that tariffs brought manufacturing jobs back to America, encouraged countries to invest here, and gave the U.S. leverage in trade negotiations. The deal with China involving soybeans and agricultural products that reportedly came about because of tariff pressure. There's also the legal question, does the president have this authority or not? The Supreme Court said no to one legal justification, but didn't close the door on others. The administration is already using a different statute, and legal experts suggest there are multiple tools available. Section 122, 201, 301 of various trade laws. Here's what makes this complicated. Economic policy doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it's really difficult to isolate cause and effect. Did the economy perform well because of tariffs, despite tariffs, or for completely unrelated reasons? Economists disagree on this constantly. What we can say is that expert predictions about immediate economic catastrophe didn't materialize. That's factual. But we also know that many small businesses felt real financial pressure. That's also factual. Both things can be true simultaneously. The legal back and forth raises questions about executive power and checks and balances. Some people believe the president needs flexibility to respond quickly to economic threats and unfair trade practices. Others worry about concentrated power and prefer congressional oversight. These are long-standing constitutional debates that go way beyond any single administration. The question of that $175 billion is fascinating from a practical standpoint. If it gets refunded to companies, does that stimulate the economy? If it stays with the government, what happens to it? Nobody seems to know yet, and that uncertainty affects business planning and economic forecasting. What we're witnessing is the intersection of law, economics, and political strategy playing out in real time. The Supreme Court made a ruling, the administration immediately adapted, and now we'll see how this unfolds over the coming months and years, because yes, this will likely involve years of litigation. For everyday Americans, the practical questions are, will prices go up or down? Will jobs increase or decrease? Will trade relationships strengthen or weaken? Those answers probably won't be clear for quite a while, and they'll depend on many factors beyond just tariff policy. Whether you think tariffs are good economic policy or not, one thing is clear. This issue isn't going away anytime soon, and reasonable, intelligent people are going to continue disagreeing about it, which, in a democracy, is actually how it's supposed to work. What's your take on this situation? Feel free to share your thoughts respectfully in the comments.